Good morning. It is Monday, April 17th, 2017, a regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. We have a reserved 10-minute public comment period at the beginning of each meeting, and you can comment in any manner except a matter that we're currently under deliberations for. So do we have somebody from the public that would like to speak? Looks like we don't, so we'll move to item number 2. Other items it's items from commission and staff. Any items from commissioners? I know Commissioner Borofsky has something.
Yeah, I made copies of these maps. They're from the Lane Livability Consortium, and it was just something that came up when I was at one of my subcommittee assignments at the Community Development Block Grant Committee. A slide went up and it referenced income and poverty and where in our community those people that are lower income or on food stamps or free lunches and those types of things came up, and I looked at it and it just clicked on the PowerPoint for one click, and I looked at it, and initially I thought it was our 3 key transit corridors because they were almost identical. And so I just printed off those maps and a map of the key corridors that we have just for you guys to have for your information. One of my concerns is that our emphasis in Vision Eugene is developing along key corridors and commercial areas, putting most of our housing for the next 20 years. And there is a lot of housing along those corridors, but they're lower income housing. So my concern is that if we develop all of those and redevelop those, will they still be in the income bracket where people can afford to live? And if not, where will those people end up living in the next 20 years? So it was just a snapshot. I thought it'd be interesting for some of the other commissioners to see. And then also the Lane Livability Consortium, that was a project that was put together through LCOG, and they've got just a myriad of information and data and maps and stuff like that. That is a great resource that we had a presentation here on it about probably 2 years ago. Stephanie Jennings came in and did it, and I just hope that those don't live on the shelf somewhere. I hope that our staff and commissioners can do this.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So actually, kind of tying into that, the Missing Middle lecture that happened last week, a lot of folks were able to go to the lecture on Tuesday. Unfortunately, there was a public hearing here, so a lot of people couldn't go. But they were able to actually record it, so I'll be sending out that link later, and that actually does help address some of the things I'm sure that Lane Livability Consortium and Housing Policy Board is talking about in terms of how do we provide all of those different types of housing. So I can send out that link later. And then everybody here too, for public outreach stuff, the city manager's office has pulled together some data about recruitment. We had 25 people apply to the Planning Commission, which is awesome. And also too, overall, I'll get some more Planning Commission specific demographics this Thursday. There was actually a lot of geographic diversity this time around. So whatever staff or folks did, thank you for that, because they had double the applicants as last year, and a lot more geographic diversity and a lot more wards represented. So awesome news on that front. So whatever you did for outreach, thank you, because it worked.
Okay, any other items from other commissioners? Commissioner Jaworski, you want to tell us about your trip?
No.
Okay.
I just wanted to say I did miss several meetings, and I have reviewed the tapes and material on those when we get into other deliberations.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Commissioner Randall and then Commissioner Borofsky.
And I guess I'll just jump in with Commissioner Borofsky's presentation on the maps. And I think the potential upside to all of that, too, is that people that are economically disadvantaged generally rely, I think, more on public transit as well, and so that could be a win-win. But I understand your concerns with the potential pricing them out of the market aspect. But I think at least it's a start from the standpoint of getting transit where it's probably most needed.
Commissioner Borofsky.
one more thing. I attended the city council work session on inclusionary zoning that was last Wednesday, and staff, or city council directed staff to go back and touch base with some of the commissions, and they didn't mention the planning commission, and I'm just wondering if that might be something that you want to keep this body in the loop on. They talked about the Human Rights Commission and some of the other commissions that they wanted to get feedback from. I don't know if you want to get put into that loop, considering his zoning.
Yeah, Planning Commission had a presentation on the legislation. I believe Stephanie came and talked to you about that already once a few months ago. Is that correct? No? I seem to remember that. Well, I'll loop back to Stephanie on that. Thank you.
Any other comments from Planning Commission? No? Okay, so we'll move to staff. Items from staff.
In the interest of moving forward with all the discussion that we have today, I'm going to keep it real short, but just a reminder that this evening at 5:30 in Harris Hall, there's the public hearing for the Transportation System Plan. This is the second public hearing again, so throw that out for you. April 19th at City Council this Wednesday, noon in Harris Hall. There's a discussion about Broadway Plaza next steps, sort of part of the ongoing conversation around downtown. There are a few hearings official meetings scheduled coming up, April 26th, May 10th, May 24th. Won't get into the details on those, but just a heads up that there's a few of those out there. Continuing land use review activity. Our next meeting here, obviously, is April 24th, a week from today, to conclude the UGB adoption process with your recommendation. And we have a meeting the following week that's still tentatively on the calendar. We're leaving that there in case we need it for other work. But again, we really do need to finish up next Monday on this.
Perfect.
Okay.
And the hearing dates, those are set. They're established. They're not tentative. I just wanted to verify.
Which hearing dates?
You said there's a few hearing dates in...
For the hearings official.
For the
yes.
hearings official, not for us.
Yes, for the
Okay.
hearings official.
Perfect.
Yes.
And is that good for you?
I'm
okay.
good.
Emily?
I just wanted to let you know that the appeal period for the Land Use Board of Appeals on your adjustment review decision on the HAXA, the Oaks development, was last Monday, and we did not receive anything in the mail during the week, so we are going with there's been no appeal of it. So, FYI.
Thank you. Any other items from staff? Okay, I did one more person from the public snuck in, so I just want to verify we have on our agenda always that you're good. No comments for Planning Commission? Okay, so we'll move to agenda item number 3. So we are continuing, as Robin stated, we're continuing with our deliberations. And today, the UGB adoption package, we're focusing specifically on the Clear Lake Overlay Zone, which we did get it copied again in our Planning Commission packet for this week. Staff, do you want to
Yes, thank you.
provide an introduction?
Yeah, so I figured what we would do today is walk you through the latest version of the Clear Lake Overlay Zone that is attached to your packet. But before we do that, I wanted Emily to provide a little bit of the framing for the public comments that we received on this issue and how we're addressing that.
So really, I just kind of wanted to acclimate you to the legal backdrop for today's discussion. We specifically are proposing an expansion in Clear Lake Zone to meet very particular needs, and those are needs for large industrial sites. There's a lot of information and evidence in the record that we have a shortage of those, and in the EOA, which is Chapter 2 of your employment study, talks a lot about specifically how many of these lots we need and what size ranges. So, for example, you need, the city of Eugene over the next 20 years should have 3 sites that are between 50 and 75 acres. And this collection of sites, 11 of them, are what we call the portfolio. And state law says, you know, when you expand for a particular need like that, you have to preserve the land that you're expanding onto to meet those needs. And there have been some concerns because we've been told that there are other communities in the state that have expanded for a particular need but lacked the regulations to keep them from being developed in other ways, which doesn't get them what they need, and it also uses important agricultural land for something that maybe wasn't necessary. State law in statewide planning goal 14, in one of the rules that implements it, and in another rule that implements industrial and commercial uses specifically, requires the city, when it expands the UGB for specific purposes like ours, so particularly site size, that we have to adopt regulations that will manage the uses and the divisions of lots in the expansion area to maintain their potential to meet your needs. Specifically, we have to protect, this is a quote from one of the rules, protect sites suitable for the proposed use by limiting land divisions and permissible uses and activities that interfere with the development of the site for the intended use. So we heard some testimony that believed the Clear Lake Overlay Zone, which is the tool that the city's using to regulate both lot standards and uses, that it wasn't strong enough to actually ensure that preservation, that things could happen under the way Clear Lake Zone was originally written that would take that land off the table for a large industrial user. Basically, within the Clear Lake Overlay Zone, you have a couple of tools that you can use to make sure you comply with these standards. You have the uses and the development standards, and then you also have lot standards, both of which I think Terry's going to talk about today. So that's sort of the backdrop and the reason why you're looking at some staff proposed recommendations for altering the original version a little bit. Any questions about that? Okay.
Okay, good. Also, as a way of introduction, I wanted to acknowledge that this overlay zone, as you know, has been under development for a number of years. You might recognize Zach in the audience who worked on this, and a subcommittee, which included members of the Planning Commission, Human Rights Commission, and Sustainability Commissions, as well as community groups like Beyond Toxics and the Active Bethel Citizens, participated on the early drafts of this overlay zone. And it comes from council direction. So back in 2012, when we presented our urban growth boundary recommendations, our preliminary ones, the council specifically directed us to develop residential compatibility measures in this area and to address environmental justice concerns. So that's one of the goals of the Clear Lake Overlay Zone, as you know, and with the other goal being preservation of the large lots. So none of that has changed. We have continued to make improvements to this language as we've discovered loopholes or problems with it. And the latest and greatest is attached to your agenda today. And what we thought we would do is just walk through, it's not that long of a zone, just walk through and note for you what is the same and where there has been a substantive change. Does that work as far as methodology? Okay. Okay, then the first item that I want to call your attention to is the purpose. So I'm on attachment A to the Planning Commission agenda, page 1 of 6. And there haven't been any changes, so we can hopefully go on past the purpose unless you all during your deliberations want to address that. No changes. The purpose remains the same. The next section is about the applicability of the overlay zone, and that also stays the same, as does the next section relating to siting requirements. Where we do want to call your attention to some changes starts in the next section, 9.4165. This is the part of the code that regulates development standards. When a lot is ready to develop, what are the standards? So there are a few consistency changes, and you have the previously proposed also attached to your packet for a side-by-side comparison if you would like. But there are some minor ones in there. And the first substantive change is under section 2A. So 2A, there's a new standard called single business operation. And this was proposed because of the concerns that Emily was starting to talk about. And the concern basically was that the city's need is for large lots for large businesses that need a large lot. And if the city doesn't have a standard like this, there was concern that industrial park type uses could be developed and then rented to several small businesses that are totally unrelated. And so this is our attempt to write a standard that is clear and objective, as it needs to be in this section of the code, to limit development of these large sites to a single business operation. So that's the first one. And I think maybe I should just go through and then we'd have discussion if that works.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's the first one I wanted to note for you. The next one under separation, subsection 2D, is a clarification and actually a clarification that these separation requirements do not extend to the airport property. This was a question I believe Commissioner Borowski had earlier, and so we've added some language there, the language that says except property lines of parcels owned by the City of Eugene Airport. That's new text that clarifies that we don't expect uses to set back from the airport. That was the intent. Okay, moving on to the next one. It's in the same section. The next substantive change is sub D11, where it talks about wholesale, warehousing, and distribution uses. Now, the idea of this section is that those uses are allowed, but they need to be set back a certain distance from residential and public uses. But we've added an exemption. And so the parenthetical clause here, starting with unless provided in association, is to exempt certain targeted industries from this standard. So if you are a targeted industry, such as food and beverage manufacturing, you are allowed to do these things, wholesaling, warehousing, and distribution, as a part of your overall endeavor. And that really was added because we didn't want to preclude things like a food hub or a conglomeration of businesses that are related and may share such things like, distribution like a loading dock, for example, where different food businesses can share a facility and benefit from that co-location. That's what we're trying to get at here. Okay. Moving along. Subsection 3 performance standards are all the same. No changes to that. No changes to the subsection 4 prohibited use list. That's the same. Also no changes to 5 adjustment review. And then we get to the other area where we do have proposed changes, and that is the lot standards. So this whole section, 9.4170, relates to how properties can be divided, reconfigured, or property lines adjusted. And the approach here is fairly, it is a revision to become more clear and more specific to how we deal with each lot in this area. There really aren't that many lots, and before we had divided it up into subsections and tried to anticipate what future development scenarios might produce. And instead what we've done, as is shown on the new map with more specific labels on it, this is the more specific map attached. We've labeled every lot and referred to it in the text so that a property owner of a particular site knows exactly what they're allowed to do and when. So that's really the intent of this whole cleanup of this section, is to refer to the lots by their labeled numbers. So that's really clear. And the other thing that was added in here under subsection 3 is a definition of unconstrained land. So you might remember some of the testimony we received was about the fact that we didn't define what the constraints are. And the worry was that a property owner could find a loophole that way and create a parcel that was entirely unbuildable. And yet, the city would check it off of our list of needed sites. And we don't want that to happen. So what we've done is use the same constraints that we used in our study, our expansion study. Things like the 5% slope, special flood hazard area, Goal 5 protected areas, wetlands that don't yet have a fill permit, and overlay zones that prohibit development, and call that unconstrained land. So there's a definition of that now embedded within the code language that should really clarify what the city's intent is as far as obtaining those portfolio sites and how and when additional lots can be created. So that's the overview of that section. I already mentioned the map has new labels on it. That's a new map that reflects the text changes. And that is it. No changes to the figure key on the last page of the overlay zone. One other thing I'd like to provide as part of the overview, and that is that we have had a chance to loop back with several property owners and with Thousand Friends who raised these concerns. And your record is closed, so we don't have letters from them, but we wanted to share with you their reaction to these proposed revisions. And starting with Thousand Friends, the reaction was very positive. So I can't quote directly, but the email said, "Wonderful job. Thank you for taking into consideration all of these issues. And Thousand Friends would be proud to support it." So that was pretty encouraging as far as the main testimony that we received and looping back with the person who made that testimony. And then we've continued to reach out to property owners and explain what this means for their properties, and continue to do that through the email list that we have for all of the interested parties in the Clear Lake area.
What is have there been any responses?
We had 2 meetings with different property owners, and those both were fairly positive. You know, questions about down the road, for example, when will Terry Street extension be, when will it be decided where that right-of-way is going? And that's a future decision that we explained and talked with the property owner about the process for that. That's an example. Anything else to report? There's nothing that I feel is unresolved at this point that I have heard from a property owner or interested party that's been tracking this and that we've needed to respond to. Yeah.
So, just Planning Commission, do we have any questions before we start to dive into the details? Do we have any questions for staff? Commissioner Jaworski?
Yeah, under the purpose, it indicates that I have 2. Under questions, it indicates in the purpose that you're trying to have restrictions so that things are not incompatible as far as emission and particulate to the residents living in the area. Then on page 3 of 6, you cite that odors and emissions will be by state and/or LARAPA. Have you looked at what their standards are to see if they are going to be actually compatible with neighborhoods? I know that in my work, when there were permitted emissions by various companies, they were not compatible with neighborhoods. They were standards that were set by the state. So have you looked at those to see that these standards are so restrictive that they won't impact the neighborhoods surrounding them?
In general, yes, and I'm looking at Zach because this is a really big part of the early work on the overlay, was talking with neighborhood groups, LRAPA staff, and other members of the subcommittee to talk about what the enforcement procedures would be like. So this is current code that works enabling our staff at the permit counter to use to enforce complaints that are already, mechanisms that are already on the books. we did have a fair amount of conversation about the LRAPA issues, and some of the standards that have been put into this code draw on the lessons that they have learned and that we have learned from other places where there've been a lot of complaints about air quality. So we've tried to anticipate those by prohibiting certain uses and requiring separation and those kinds of things. And then existing odors and emissions and other standards are another layer of protection that already exists within their process. So I don't know if that addresses your concern, but it definitely has been a big topic of conversation. And I think the intent is to recognize that this overlay goes farther than we have currently gone in the past, and people were hoping that it would provide us a forum for testing this new approach. We won't really know until it's in place, but that's the goal.
By testing, you mean part of the monitoring will be looking at this also?
Yeah, we are hoping to monitor the success of the overlay as a whole.
So I want to add on that. You know, the code already in a different part of the code that's not at issue has noise and I believe odor provisions. What this specifically says under A, you know, in addition to actually just prohibiting the uses that we know are particularly offensive, it notes that LRAPA and state remain applicable, but it also adds a new standard for our own enforcement. What it says is emissions of smoke, dust, fumes, odors, or gases, they can't be noticeable at the property line by a human observer relying on human senses without the aid of a device, which means that we as an entity now have an enforcement section. And then it also notes, additionally, we can rely on LRAPA and the state. So it actually does impose a new standard and doesn't just rely on LRAPA.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sure.
Second question, quick one. On page 2 of 6, the new section on 211, you talk about where warehousing, distribution, and everything is added. I'm assuming you mean on the same site of a business, although it doesn't say that. When I read this, I got the assumption that since you don't want, like you said, business parks, someone could move in and say, hey, we had a couple of businesses here that located that do this. I'm going to take my parcel and just do warehousing and distribution. Is that permitted, or is it only associated with the business that's already on the site? Because this wasn't clear to me.
Yeah. It is only allowed in association with another business under this subsection, because here we're talking about uses that require a buffer, uses that require a separation. So for this list, wholesaling and warehousing and distribution is one of those uses that requires separation. But then we're saying, unless you're doing it as part of a cluster of businesses that are related, that's why we added this exemption. So elsewhere in the code, you are still allowed to do warehousing and distribution as a standalone use.
As a standalone use. Okay, that's what I just wanted to get. Thank you.
I have Commissioner Nicololo and then Commissioner Mills and Commissioner Baker.
I'll try and go quick. So just a quick question on the letter from LRAPA. I might be misreading the code, but that's if you're able to go right to building permit, you need to obtain the pre-clearance letter from LRAPA. That's in EC 9.4165 subsection B. Mm-hmm. So if you go right to building permit, you need to obtain the pre-clearance?
Yes.
Okay. But for a land use application, you would not need to obtain a pre-clearance letter?
There are additional regulations if you have a land use application.
That are subject to the industrial zone standards that already exist?
No matter what, any building permit would be required to comply with these standards. So whether or not they've been through land use application process, they may address this during the land use application process. They have the ability to do so, and if they haven't, then it would be caught at the time of the building permit.
Okay, I might bring this up in deliberations, but I would recommend rewriting that. I know that it's probably written a very specific legal way, but from a planning perspective, if I was trying to interpret that, I would interpret that as if I'm not doing a land use application, but if I was interpreting that, I would think that as if I'm doing a land use application and I'm addressing that through the land use criteria, I would not need to do a pre-clearance letter. So if that's what you're intending for someone to do a building permit, that needs to be probably more specific. I'll also probably bring these up in deliberations as well, but oh, I just lost it. Sorry, guys. In EC 9.4170, the Clear Lake Overlay Zone Lot Standards, I'm really struggling to see how they're clear and objective. And maybe they are clear and objective, but I'm just struggling to interpret the criteria. And so kind of just using that as a litmus test for how that may be interpreted in the future. Can staff kind of talk about how that was developed in a clear and objective fashion? This would be really helpful for the deliberations.
You want to take a shot at that, Sarah? I mean,
Sure.
the standards in this section have always intended to be clear and objective, and this rewrite intended to get even more specific with references to specific map labels and what those are allowed to do. Would you add anything?
So I guess what would be helpful for me is if there was particular language that you could point out that felt difficult to interpret.
Absolutely.
For you that I could specifically address.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say probably for me, subsection 3 is difficult for me to interpret, especially how that relates to subsection 4. Subsection 2 and subsection 5 are relatively clear cut. I think I get those, but subsection 3 and 4 in particular, especially because they seem almost. I'm curious to see how subsection 3 and subsection 4 relate. So yeah, if you could just walk me through those.
Sure.
Just to make sure I'm doing well.
The way that the different subsections, other than subsection 1, which gives a broader context for people interpreting the code and working with the code, subsections 2, 3, and 4 specifically reference the map, the figure 9.4170, and looking at what the different labels are and how those then affect the lot standards for those sites. So for subsection 2, you have everything that has an S label, which are all of the tax lots that would be in the expansion but are coming in at less than 10 acres, and so they're not actually a part of our large lot portfolio. And so those have a different set of standards because they're not needed to meet that large lot portfolio, so we're not applying additional restrictions on their ability to divide or to change their lot configuration. Everything in subsection 3 is referring to the A, B, C, D lots, and that is where the most detail is because those are the things that require the most protection. And so that has all of that language that Terry mentioned about what is, if they do want to pursue a property line adjustment, what are the constraints that need to be considered, but also the clear and objective sort of if you don't want to dig into those particular pieces, just leaving the tax lots as they are, with the exception of the C2A1 L-shaped lot, because it is already divided by a tax lot, so honoring those tax lot lines. And then with subsection 4, addressing the specific tax lot that is the asterisk tax lot, which is very constrained by the water quality overlay and the future road. And so just acknowledging that the rules that apply to the other tax lots don't apply there. So trying to have that specific lot by lot assessment of these are the rules that apply to you was how we were trying to be as clear and objective as possible.
Okay, I think I'll address more in deliberations, but subsection 3 in particular almost reads as if it's rendering itself redundant, because I would interpret that as tax lots in existence as of January 1, 2017 that meet an identified portfolio need are prohibited from land division with the exception of that one tax lot. But then you say portfolio tax lots may pursue a property line adjustment so long as the property line adjustment does not reduce either tax lot. And so my question that might be helpful to kind of meet out is where does land division differ from property line adjustments in the purview of this code? And I think also too, I kind of try and go with the litmus test of, is this something that like my grandmother could relatively understand? And like I know that I'm kind of struggling with this right now and I do this professionally. So just kind of maybe thinking about how that language can be more clear cut would be really helpful.
I can't remember. Do property line adjustments come to this body? Do you guys regularly deal with property line adjustments? So for those of you, and perhaps our viewing public, who don't recognize it, land divisions are partitions and subdivisions. They take one lot and divide that one lot to create, to result in either 2 lots or 3 lots, partitions. Subdivisions take one lot and result in 4 or more. Property line adjustments are a different creature. They're also, that's a term in the code. You apply for it, and it takes an existing property line that's between a couple of lots and moves it. So you start with 2 lots, you end with 2 lots. I think in a property line adjustment, you can involve 3 parcels and move 2 different, but you always end up with the same number of lots than you. So that's the difference between those 2 terms. And generally, property line adjustments are handled more administratively, I believe.
And it's interesting to me that does the code typically say land division as opposed to subdivision or partition? Because those are the specific application types. So to refer to it as land division, I think may
Cause
also
confusion.
cause some confusion.
That could certainly be teased out. I think that it's pretty commonly referred to as sort of referring to both of those, and it may be even in the definitions, but that doesn't always mean that's the best approach.
Let me check the definitions too. Okay. I'll get back to it in deliberations. I don't want to take too much longer. Thanks, guys.
Commissioner Mills.
I don't know how appropriate some of my comments and questions are, whether I should wait for deliberation, but I'll bring them up so you can think about 3. The first one is under section 94165D3, labeled metal products, fabrication, machine welding shops, parentheses, no blast furnaces. I'm going to ask you, why do you include the blast furnaces here? I think I've asked this at least twice before, and it keeps showing up.
Is that language from the current code?
I don't care. Google blast furnaces.
I know. We haven't.
Do not put this in the code. This is, I'm sorry to be blunt, this is nonsense. Google blast furnace and look at it. It's a manufacturing operation. It's not any kind of a fabrication. It's a billion-dollar facility. There's been none built in the U.S. since the mid-'60s because they are too expensive and too energy and environmentally intensive. You don't want any separation. You're just not going to want them. But if you don't want them, there's about 100 other things you don't want first. This is a phrase that should not be here. Okay, that's enough. I'm too blunt. The next one is under item 11, and this is a question. And I understand that you're saying warehousing and distribution is not allowed unless it's for a targeted industry. Targeted industries being those things we can picture now. What if somebody wants to build a major new facility that employs a lot of people, but part of that is a warehousing operation? Will they be able to pursue that?
The short answer is yes, but it depends. This section is just about separation.
No, I understand.
Okay. So if they are within this, and we were just talking about this earlier, we have a draft of a map that shows where those separation lines apply that I think will be helpful in answering your question, but it's not available right now. I'm just very, very concerned about putting restrictions on industries that we've targeted at this point in time in our history, and that this is language going into a code that's going to exist for a long time. And we're saying, okay, well, at this point in time, these were the industries we were interested, these were not, and these we didn't even know about. And to say you're going to restrict the things you don't even know about because they're not targeted now, to me is very risky, and I really can't support this language as it's written. My final comment is under 3. I'm going to cite A and B. And I'm going to ask a question. What is the source of this language? And Can you tell me the subsection again?
I'm sorry. It's 94165 3A and B, orders and emissions and vibrations.
Okay.
First comment, these are not clear and objective, and I can picture the city being in a very clear situation of having to defend the manufacturer or the business operator because somebody smells something or feels something. And I just think this is a world of headache, the way these two things are written. You're just opening the city up for vast resources or significant resources to defend operations that you can't quantify. I'm very sympathetic, and I'm fully supporting the idea of preventing odors and emissions and providing the quality of life for residences in the area. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm really saying if you're going to do something here, you need to find a way to make this more objective. I don't think this flies the way it is.
Okay, Commissioner Baker.
Are we just asking
Oh, do you want to?
Well, I think I was kind of
fine.
responding because I didn't realize that
Please.
we weren't in deliberations yet.
Well, we can. I just thought maybe this is complicated enough to be able to flush out
Yeah.
some
You can also think
questions
about it
before
and
we.
tell me later.
Well, the only thing I wanted to point out is that the lead into this, and probably this is why the lead in reads this way, but the odors and emissions, vibrations and noise are not something that is, you don't know those problems exist until after a development has happened and is running, right? So what this standard requires, if you read subsection 3, performance standards, is that the applicant for one of these particular that exceeds 25%, they shall provide a statement on the application plans that committing the applicant to compliance with the following. So they will put in writing that they are committed to these things, and probably the idea here was to create an enforcement mechanism for later. And I don't disagree with you that enforcing these maybe a headache in the future, but these do not, A, B, and C don't have to be clear and objective, because it's very clear that what needs to happen is they have to commit to these things in writing at the time of the application. So I'm not worried that they're not clear and objective, A, B, and C, from a legal perspective. But I think it's a valid question about whether you want to set up future enforcement based on these provisions, because they, could potentially be difficult.
Because I can see where, A, they either wouldn't sign it.
Well, if they don't sign it, they don't get
wouldn't
developed, yeah.
Which is not what we're here for, okay? Or they would sign it and then basically say we're in compliance, and people will say they're not in compliance.
And then the city
And there's no
enforces.
standard to judge it against, except somebody standing out there. And I can see the city getting caught very clearly in the middle on this one.
So I think with respect to noise, I'm very comfortable with that one. It's something, because you can measure it. But to the extent you guys want to talk a little more about it, I would maybe look at the language in A and B.
That was my target. I'm not worried about noise either, because
Yeah.
you can measure noise. You can define where the property line is or where the point of listening is and measure it. I'm comfortable with noise. If we had similar abilities in odors and emissions and vibration, then it would be not an issue. But I think that the way those two previous sections are written, they're very problematic. And I think they're going to raise difficulties at several points along the way.
So I just want to check in. I'm fine if we want to not have pre-questions. It doesn't matter. I just was wondering if it would be helpful if everyone to hear questions. But so it's free form, just ask questions, deliberate as needed. I think that's probably going to help because, yeah.
It's easier, yeah.
So Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I had a couple of concerns, and I'm just wondering if they're covered by these categories. On page 3 of 6, under prohibitive uses, I wanted to note that Portland recently had some issues with glass manufacturing, colored glass manufacturing. I mean, you don't see it. It's something you have to measure, and it's difficult to measure. And we don't seem to have any prohibition on that in this zone, and yet we're aware of that there are issues with it because we've seen another large city that's had problems and in fact is shutting down some of those factories now. So I'm just wondering if it would be prudent to maybe add another clause here about whatever the wording would be correct, which you could get from Portland, colored glass manufacturing or fabrication. If that makes sense. Again, I'm not certain that it does, but I think it's certainly worth looking at, given recent history.
Staff, do you have any?
Well, what I was going to say was more of a general comment that if there's agreement and direction from the Planning Commission to include a comment like that in our memo, in your memo to the council, it doesn't need to be a code proposed piece of language at this point, and I think we talked last time about that, and have already started preparing your kind of list of things that you want to highlight for the council. So if that one sticks and the commission wants to talk about it, that's just an example. I wanted to remind you that we had talked about doing things that way, where we may not have an answer or a solution at our fingertips, but if the commission agrees that that's something you want to see looked at, you can go in your recommendation.
So let me ask you all a question, and you can give me a show of hands, just because there is more information and maybe we want to digest it. Do we want to address each of the concerns one by one, or do we want to give everybody a chance to go through this first round before we do that? How many people would like to address each of them as they come up? Show of hands. How many people would like to wait till after the first round and then start to address it? Okay. Thank you. So I'll wait. Yeah. Okay.
I had a couple more. Again, I have the changes to 11. Again, page 2 of 6. This is D11 again. I'm just trying to understand that. Is that supposed to mean that it doesn't? There's a requirement in A that says single business operation, but
That's right.
I don't understand what this means. Does it mean that a business could have a warehousing operation that would service one of the other lots? I'm trying to figure, what the wording is not clear now. If it's supposed to mean that a business can have warehousing on their site for that operation, that's fine. But this wording seems to be, it doesn't say that, it doesn't say associated with the business
Primary
operation on the lot. So I'm just trying to, again, I don't know exactly what the purpose of this, and maybe it was to provide warehousing for some other lot. That's why I'm just asking.
I have Commissioner Randall
And I
next.
had one more question.
Okay.
I mean, again, if the staff could make it clear to me. I was going to add a comment about the odors and emissions. Unfortunately, this sort of comes from standard LRAPA operations. Unfortunately, that's traditionally they have the smoke test for pollution. If you can go and see smoke,
There's smoke. That's still different. I mean, smoke. There are smoke. Measure that. That's a measurable thing.
I know.
You could cite that.
I know, but traditionally the way it was done was if you could see it from the property line visually by a person. So of course factories would dump at night when you couldn't see it.
Yep.
Anyway, it's because they don't have really the best. And I don't know what language we would suggest using there, because I think they probably pulled that from the LRAPA stuff, that clause. And I'll stop.
Right. Commissioner Randall?
Okay, thank you. I think I have two things. First, I agree with Commissioner Mills on A and B, that it is too vague. I think, so I would support, recommending adjusting that. I think, and I base that on, I have a very sensitive nose, and I can smell things that nobody else in my family can. And so I could probably hire out as a consultant to someone if need be. And so it is, I do. And so it's one of those things that I think it's just a little too vague in the way it's measured. I think obviously noise, 60 decibels, is a pretty clear measure. And I think those two on odors and emissions and vibrations need to be tightened up. So I would support that. The second one is I think I understand 11 under on page 2, and so I'm gonna say what I think it means and see if that's correct, and maybe it'll help I think, our confusion on it. I think, as Terry, you mentioned, it's really only applies to the separation, which is uses located at least 1,000 feet, or the uses that are listed here need to be at least 1,000 feet from a property line when that property line abuts government and education, parks and open space, or residential, not the airport. And so they're required to set back 1,000 feet. The wholesale warehousing and distribution, which is approved in any of these zones, has to be set back 1,000 feet from those property lines unless it's associated with one of the targeted industries that are listed in Envision Eugene. Then it doesn't have to be subject to that 1,000-foot setback. Is that correct? Okay.
Where does it say that? I don't see that at all.
That's the way it, well, that whole subsection is separation. So it really only applies to the uses listed here being separated from I guess you could call it setback. That might be that might be clearer if you called it a setback. These items 1 through 11 have to be set back from that abutting property line at least 1,000 feet when that property line abuts government and education, parks and open space, or residential. So maybe setback might be a clearer wording on that. But then, wholesale warehousing distribution is allowed anyway.
But
In the other codes, if you're not abutting any of those uses, you can put your warehouse and distribution and wholesale pretty much wherever the code allows.
You don't have to be a targeted industry.
And you don't have to be a targeted industry. It's only the targeted industries that get a pass on that setback.
That's right.
And only when that setback is abutting government and education, parks and open space, and residential. Otherwise, it's just a normal thing.
So, staff, before we move on, can you, and if you're not prepared to answer right now, maybe wait for a couple of commissioners, which tax lots or which lots are actually impacted by this? It might help with the discussion to understand what the context is. Are we talking about, so provide some clarity. So I have Commissioner Jaworski and then Commissioner Borofsky. Commissioner Jaworski?
No, I have nothing new. I didn't know, I'm waiting for the discussion of things
Okay.
that have been brought up.
So we'll go to Commissioner Borofsky.
Okay, so I've got a couple of different things that have been brought up.
I don't think that's very
And,
clear at all. I know what you said, but I don't read that when you...
And so I did do a drawing of where that 1,000 feet is. Basically, it runs below Clear Lake Road. And it would have, the airport property one, I put it on there, and it took off half of our, on the north side of Clear Lake Road. The one question I did have was if Bethel School District decides to build the one that's the school, would that 1,000 feet from that go north of Clear Lake Road, Zach?
Yes.
So that's going to impact a fair amount of property because 1,000 feet is almost a quarter mile. So it would have been nice to have that map. Getting to the second issue that I have as far as targeted industries and odors, we're asking for one of our targeted industries is the food and beverage manufacturing. Food and beverage manufacturing have odors. If you're making an applesauce plant, it's going to smell like apples. Kristen and I can attest to when there was a Williams Bakery site next to us, there was a nice smell of baked bread that you could smell at Hendricks Park. You didn't have to be standing at the property line.
Coffee at my house every morning.
So I think that we're kicking ourselves in the foot. Look, in the Metro Plan, or excuse me, in the comp plan, targeted industries are one thing, and then we're trying to regulate against them in another, because you wouldn't be able to get those targeted industries. Another one of the targeted industries in the comprehensive plan is advanced wood products. If you go to prohibited uses, one of the prohibited uses, number M, this is on page 5, is reconstituted wood products manufacturing. Basically what that means to me today is an MDF plant or a particle board plant. But that is such a broad and not clear and objective standard to me. A lot of the things that I think are going to be happening in wood products in the next 20 years are going to be taking what might have been, 30 years ago, the sawdust got burned in wigwams. You don't see wigwams anymore. The technology has advanced. We're looking at building parking garages from advanced wood products that could fall into the category of reconstructed wood products. But in the comprehensive plan, we're looking for advanced wood products. So I would hope that we can take item M out. And I understand where that came from, that an MDF plant that's out off of Roosevelt and Beltline, if that were built today, is going to be a lot different plant. And we have protections of odors and LRAPA and all of these other things that I think will get to the concerns that we're having with reconstituted manufacturing. On wholesale warehousing and distribution, the lens that we looked through to find these spots was near a freight route, and to discourage warehousing and distribution, when the one lens that we looked at to limit a lot of the sites around the UGB was that it had to be a mile from a freight route. Again, I'm not seeing the nexuses there. With that, I will wait and do the next round.
Have myself in the queue, and it's somewhat related to Commissioner Borofsky's discussion. One of my concerns is single business operation. Many industrial businesses, quite frankly, are not a single business operation. Many of them actually do several types of operation within one ownership. So that's where, maybe if we just look at that, it might actually start to make more sense in separation in some of the other categories. Because, for instance, wholesale warehousing and distribution, if associated with a use that's actually an allowed use, not a prohibited use, within this overlay, could make complete sense. So it's like there seems to be some, like Commissioner Borofsky talked about, some contradiction that's kind of inherent with some of, or not contradiction, it's just there's probably more restriction than maybe we intend. So I start with the bigger question of what's a single business operation. That might be a killer to begin with.
Can I address that?
Yeah,
just kind of bring
please.
you back to the law. I think the comments made by Commissioner Borofsky are really well taken, because it harkens back to the legal issue that I think we obscure a little bit when we start talking about conglomerations of users. And that is that, we have industrial sites in the city limits. We have almost enough small sites. We have a very small deficit of small sites that we're satisfying serendipitously, basically, through this expansion for the large sites. But if we were to take, 5 or 10 related small users and put them on one of these large sites, we're not really doing what our targeted industry said they need. We're enabling use of these sites for something other than what we expanded for. Maybe if you can talk a little bit more around this idea of, maybe it is an industry to have 5 different manufacturers using potatoes in one place, or there may be some, maybe we need to define single business operation in a way. That's what I'm gleaning from a number of your comments, and that's what I've defined single business operation, and we may need to work with council a little more on that, but we have to keep coming back to, and instead of just total flexibility, we have to keep it focused on what we expanded for, and that was industries that have passed us over because we didn't have what they needed, which is a large site.
So let me give you an example, because I think that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about multiple tenant users. I'm talking about one single industry. There's oftentimes one industry will have their laboratory where they're doing testing, then they actually do manufacturing of what they've just tested, and they have a distribution center to send their product out. That is one business. Mm-hmm. And when you're going to get a large lot like that, you might be getting industry that has multiple operations. So that's where the word operations is a function of their business. It's not a use, because I would say their use is wood product, whatever that larger use is from a use category. And then there's accessory uses that are attached to their main use. That makes sense from a code standpoint. Here, you're using a different word, operation. And if you look at other code sections that talk about operations, like, for instance, the CUP talks about operations, it's the operations of that industrial use.
I think that's a really good point. And maybe some conversation with Eco Northwest and Business Oregon, where, like, they probably have this dialed in terms of terminology or can help us along with that. So more comments around the intent and what we were expanding for might be the best input for today, so that we can either come back with something or include that on the list of things you want council to nail.
Clearly defining that would be important.
Yeah. And maybe defining it in a way that uses a different term.
Right.
Okay.
So I have one other item, and then I'll wait for the other ones in deliberations, is can you talk to me, and I was a part of the subcommittee, but I think it's probably good for everybody to hear, and I know that Zach was going to follow up with this. Has there been some evaluation about what this setback does to the developability, the viability of these properties? That's the question I had, and I know we talked about the importance of the 1,000 square feet, and we had talked about actually having staff go back, try to figure out what does that mean to these properties, which gets to Commissioner Borofsky's comment. So that's another question, just, the third item, actually, I'm going to add, and that is, I heard at one of the, it was the one at the Bethel School, that neighborhood meeting. I heard from two people. They're concerned, two neighbors. They're concerned about the growth of the cannabis industry and having some of these industrial properties adjacent to the school actually be related to cannabis. So I just thought I would bring that up as maybe not a compatible use adjacent to a school.
It's an EFU use.
Yeah. So, and I'm not sure, if there were detail, they didn't really offer details. It seemed like so should we continue unless staff had more comments about mine? Okay, so I have, should we go back to Commissioner Jaworski? Did you want to add, I still have you in the queue.
Yeah, I didn't want to add anything. I'm waiting for.
Yeah, well, I think we're through the round, so go for it. But I have Commissioner Jaworski, Mills, then Baker, unless you feel like this is something.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think let's just open up, okay, Commissioner
Are you
Jaworski.
going to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you going, well, I don't know what you're doing here. Are you going to walk through page 1 of 6 and have the person who listed that concern on that page and then talk about it? How do we do this rather than just randomly jumping around?
Well, I think we're still actually discussing it, and I think when we're ready.
Okay, well then I don't need to talk now.
Okay.
I'm waiting for discussion.
You're waiting for a discussion on particular items. Got it. So I have Commissioner Mills, then Commissioner Baker, and Commissioner Borofsky.
I have two. One is a comment. I'd like to reinforce what Commissioner Borofsky's concern is about item 4M, page 3 of 6, for reconstituted wood products. He's hit the nail right on the head there. If advanced wood products is your target, one of your target industries, this is conflicts with that. And then the next one is back on page 2 of 6, back to wholesale warehousing and distribution. Separation. I guess I just wanted to ask staff a question. You know, we're putting in separation, and the reason we're putting in the separation requirement, refresh my memory, why we're putting in the separation requirement.
It was to address impacts of a lot of trucking and uses that could have impacts on adjacent uses. So just to get a little bit more of a buffer between residential and park uses and industrial activity.
But we're willing to exempt that for targeting.
Right. Right. It's a balance. I mean, everything in here is trying to provide as much flexibility as we can while protecting those concerns that have been brought up.
I don't understand how that protects anything, because the traffic's still going to be on Clear Lake Road. Then they turn in 1,000 feet where there's nothing, and then I don't understand it, actually. I don't see how it's buffering anything when they all have to come down that road anyway, and that road isn't 1,000 feet from residential property. It's just a comment.
Commissioner Baker.
That was one of my concerns, was to the access. So whether you have the warehousing happening here, but you've got the driveway and you're not prohibiting the traffic from impacting the street in front of the school or whatever.
It wasn't just the traffic, though. It was the
other
uses.
Yeah. My other concern, I just need a clarification from staff. Does 11 say that you could have warehousing for this single building operation that can be used by, it's like, if you look at the map, can we say that the warehousing operation at B1 could be used by D1? Is that what the code is?
No,
language
the
is trying
intent
to-
was that it could be in association with a primary use, which is what I would suggest we add to that.
Okay,
if you want
that's
to
all I
clarify.
wanted to know, so.
Okay.
So I got to, we need to discuss that before you start throwing restrictions like that.
We'll get to each of the items. Commissioner Borowski.
So I have a question. It's outside of this packet. It's in the adjustment review section. And for the rest of the people, it's on page 28 of the Clear Lake overzone in here. Section D of that is that you can apply for.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Brosky, can you give the code section?
Yes, it's code section 9.8030, adjustment review approval criteria for the Clear Lake area zone. Again, it's on page 28 of the Clear Lake thing in our thing. I just had a question about section D. So basically it says you have to, if they follow all of these adjustment reviews are applicable. And it says the proposed use advances the city's goal for increased employment opportunities by meeting or exceeding the average of 10 employees per net acre. And it goes, so that's one of the criteria. And I'm just wondering where that came from, and that seems like an awfully high bar considering the size lots we're looking at. We've got a 75-acre lot. That means to trigger that part of adjustment review, you would have to have 750 employees. 50 acres would be 500 employees. Can you answer me where that number 10 came from, and if that is an appropriate number?
Eco Northwest is approaching the table. Beth Goodman.
So that number, 10 employees per acre, came from work that we've done on economic opportunities analysis over the many, many years, looking at average employment densities for businesses of the types that you're looking at. So typically, employment densities range from, say, 2 or 3 employees per acre for something like warehouse and distribution, sometimes above 10 to 15 employees per acre
for certain types of manufacturing employment. So 10 employees per acre is a rule of thumb that's typically used in economic opportunities analysis about manufacturing.
So, to me, that it might seem, thank you for that
Sure.
thing. It seems to me that might be onerous and just basically make adjustment reviews almost impossible, especially considering some of the targeted industries that we have. So let's say that a targeted industry is a food and beverage manufacturer, and they go in and they've got an applesauce plant. Well, they may have 500 employees during apple season, but they may not have 500 employees not during apple season. Again, I would like to see that lowered a little bit, possibly, just for the ability to use this section of the code. Because how many industries in Eugene have 750 employees other than the city of Eugene, University of Oregon, and possibly Peace Health? I don't think any of our mills have 750 employees. I don't think, and so a lot of these mills, a lot of this industry that is getting more and more automated, doesn't mean we don't want them. But if you need to have an adjustment review to get your business in here, I think that's a fairly high threshold.
So I have Commissioner Nicolello and then Commissioner Mellis. Do you have new information, or should we now go through the text and stop at the various items that have been concerned? Or do you have new?
I have a question, but it's a quick one. If
Yeah,
it helps.
Commissioner Nicolello.
Did you want to comment, Jackie?
Yeah, mine is just a quick comment on
Yeah.
Echo Northwest use of the number. I would challenge the number. If you're saying it's based upon past history and it's not looking forward, I would say that it's very suspect.
Well, you've got issues about automation that are becoming more and more common.
That's what we're going to be dealing with.
However, when we were doing the the economic opportunities analysis, I apologize, that was a few years ago. So that was certainly, we've got information in there about employment in Eugene historically. And it did hit the 10 employees per acre, even in the heavy industrial areas, I believe, if I'm remembering right. So I don't necessarily disagree with you, but it is based on the information we have.
So 75-acre lot, you found a 75-acre lot that had 750 employees?
No.
Okay.
No, we were looking at existing employment in Eugene. And I'm not saying we didn't find a 75-acre lot. I'm saying that I don't know what size the lot is that we found.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So just a quick question for EC 9.4165. 1B, and then how it relates to subsection 3. I'm just curious why that pre-clearance letter is in the application requirements and not under the performance standards, since those tend to relate to impacts. So it just seems to be an interesting spot for that.
It's a legal issue. The city can't have some outside entity responsible for having the ability to yay or nay a development. And if Luba has told us that we can make things like this an application requirement, so they have to get it as part of what they give us in the first place, but we can't require them to give it to us later.
So it's in. This is where I think we get into the clear and objective problem, and I absolutely think that having LARAPA issue a pre-clearance letter is a great idea. If we're going to be doing uses, we want to make sure that we have all of the information at the table. The question I have for you then is that an informational standard? And because it's an informational standard, can you technically require it? And then how does that relate as part of the overall application process, especially once we get into, God forbid, but if it does go to an appeals process? We ran into this really recently with the traffic impact analysis.
No, this is drafted as an application requirement, and you have to forgive me, I've read this many times, but this was not something that I drafted, so I have to.
Of course.
But it's under application requirements, which means that an application would not be deemed complete without it. Now, can someone force an application complete? Yes. Also, this requirement, it may be, we don't have any right to question what the pre-clearance letter says. It's just a requirement that a pre-clearance letter issued by LRAPA confirming that, this is, as long as this is in the record, it's a checkbox long before it ever gets to you. It doesn't come to you. It's a staff issue about, have they provided this?
So it kind of gets back to, I think, though, that same issue with the TIA where can you deny an application, could you deny an application if LRAPA said that this is something that would, would not meet air quality standards? Like, that's the question I'm trying to ask, is when you put it in as part of a checkbox, is that just information that you use to evaluate?
Right.
That's where that discrepancy is.
It would come up for you. It would be something that you would find as part of the application, a letter, if they do submit it and the box is checked, and you would look at that. That's something that staff, by doing it this way, has asked to be in the record for every application that you would review. If it's like a, conditional use permit, let's say. And you will have a criterion that might say, is this consistent, or compatible with surroundings? That letter would be evidence. If it's not there, you don't have it. But it's very, very, very difficult, other than just straight up prohibiting certain uses. And it's very, very difficult to get at the issues you guys are trying to get at. Is it better to have this than not? Ask yourselves that. Can you make it more specific what the letter has to say? Yeah, but developers have the right to force an application complete without materials like this, and we generally tell them the reason we have materials like this required is because our planning commission is going to have or planning director, hearings official, going to have a very difficult time determining that your proposal meets criteria without this thing we've asked for.
But what I'm really trying to say then is that if that standard is an application standard and not a performance standard,
right?
We need to specify that is for informational purposes. There needs to be some sort of specification as to what this information is for, else I really think that we run into the TIA situation that just happened all over again. The city has done this before where they've asked for things and haven't specified really how they want them to be used or what they're intended to be used for. I'm not questioning that a pre-clearance letter is a great idea. I think it is, and I think I might be getting into deliberations now, and for which I apologize. But once again, consciously thinking about when is something going to try and help us from an informational perspective and it's being added into the record like a TIA, or which now has a separate application, this wouldn't.
Right.
But, kind of really thinking consciously about what that, as part of that application, what does that checklist item do and what does it mean if we're going to ask for it? Because that's not clear and objective. This gets really discretionary.
I want to understand that a little bit more. What is the discretion? Help me understand what you're saying is discretionary.
So the discretionary thing about it is, let's say that I have an application, I get my pre-clearance letter, and let's say that LRAPA says that the development I'm proposing will have, it won't meet air quality standards.
That it won't?
It won't meet air quality standards.
Okay.
But the way that it's defined in your code right now is it is just, in your proposed code, is that it's a checklist item. So if it's just a checklist item and it's an informational standard, what bearing does that have on my application if I supposedly meet all of the other code? And that's where I'm talking about the discretionary kind of nebulousness of it, and just making sure that if we do that, we bear down a little bit more on what that information means in context of an application. And I'm sorry to think, of course,
I
not
understand.
everything gets appealed, but
I understand. So, the requirement is that the letter has to confirm that the proposed use and associated operations have the ability to meet air quality standards. So if the letter said that they wouldn't satisfy this, they wouldn't have a complete application. That said, are we your question really, I think, is do we later have a criterion that would apply to this applicant that would give that piece of evidence some teeth, that would allow you to use it? I don't know if that's the case, and I also don't know how many of these are outright permitted uses in this code, which wouldn't even get you to that point. So those are,
And
I understand your issue.
there's a lot of other genuine concerns, so I don't want this one to take up too much more time, but maybe that's one just kind of thinking internally about how can we be really, really clear about how we want this to be used, what we want it to be used for, and what that does in terms of the decision-making process and appeals process. Do think it's a great idea. Just want to make sure that I, clearly state that, but just how are we using it?
Okay, so I'm going to suggest, because we only have 40 minutes left, is that we move through the document. I've made notes. I've tried to capture all of them where there have been items for discussion and a straw poll vote. If I skip someone, just hold your hand out and we'll come back to it rather than unless it's directly related. Is that, so if we can get a flow to this. Yes?
Chair Taylor, I'm sorry.
Yes.
While we have Ms. Goodman at
Yes.
the table, she actually wanted to mention one more thing.
Of
And
course.
Would it be all right now?
Of course.
Okay.
So I'm not sure of the where this is in your tabs, but in the employment land study,
Which is part 2 of your employment land supply study.
and on page 108 and 109 of that, and it's also 100 the next couple pages, there's information about the employment densities that we found when we looked at employment in Eugene. And we were doing a sampling because you can't look at all employment all across the area. And what we did, we did this a little while ago, in other words, a few years ago, we selected areas that were functioning together as a big, broad site. So it's many different businesses in an area. And so looking at table 25 on page 108, industrial employment across 1,700 acres, there was about 2,100, nearly 2,200 industrial employees, and that comes in at about 13 employees per acre. You see, I'm thinking housing by now.
All of us.
So looking at light medium industrial, that plan designation, that came out the highest at 16 employees per acre. Well, campus industrial actually came out higher, but there's not as much of it at 21 employees per acre. And heavy industrial came out at 8 employees per acre. So that's what we were seeing previously. And this is 2006 employment data, because that's when we originally did this analysis back in 2008. And so this is for employment that's reported to the state by the employers. So this is the best available data on a site-by-site source. So that gives you some information about employment in Eugene. And on page 111, it's hard to see the map, but of course we can provide you with a better copy of the map to zoom in to see what areas we were looking at exactly. Because looking at, talking about Prairie Road, I kind of know where that industrial area is, but the exact boundaries of it are shown better on a bigger version of the map. So that might help.
And if you look at the next page, Highway 99, heavy industrial, 6. And if you look at North Eugene, heavy industrial, 3. And those are areas that are adjacent to where we're,
But those are heavy industrial of a very particular type.
that would be not subject to adjustment review if it was 10 per acre.
Well, heavy aren't allowed in the expansion area.
Aren't allowed.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I was getting at. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Okay, thank you, Beth. So what I'll do is I'm going to go through it, and actually what I'll do is I'll check at the end of each section if I've forgotten something so we can focus on this section. I'm going to go from this, okay?
Until we get to past where that is.
Until, right. So we're going to use the April 2017 draft that came in the AIS. So from my assessment and listening, we can skip all the way down to Commissioner Nicolello. Really, this discussion started with Section 9.4165, Section 1B. Prior to that, there weren't any comments, unless someone,
No.
okay.
Commenting on that.
So there were two items that Commissioner Nicolello brought up, the one that she just was discussing, as well as the except for land use applications. So what I would like to do is, well, it sounds like Commissioner Borowski has something to say. So, yeah.
I would just also try and put in there someplace that a clearance letter from the Lane Regional Air Protection Agency, if it's around. Okay, because there was a budget, there was talk of cutting the city's budget to it a few years back. We don't know where budget crises are going, but if another one of the people drop, if the city of Eugene were to not fund LRAP anymore, it would go away. And so I think that needs to just be addressed in there, because if it goes away, then what happens?
So,
And that's an easy fix, I think.
so based on, because we just heard the first, so let's go to the latest argument, which was further clarification of this particular item. It sounds like Emily, you're clear about Commissioner Nicolello's comments. I'm actually going to suggest, unless Commissioner Nicolello, you have strong feelings, or any other commissioners, that we basically just let staff ponder this concern. It come back, unless we want to actually dive into that. It seems a little maybe too complicated for us to actually get into that discussion.
I think that needs a good time to hang out in the city attorney's office and maybe discuss there.
Well-
I would not feel comfortable suggesting language, as I do not have a law degree.
I have Commissioner Randall.
I
Emily.
actually don't have a problem with the way it's worded,
Okay.
so I'll just get that out.
Okay. Commissioner Baker.
I was going to say, I don't have a problem with the way it's worded, because then I think the performance application, the performance standards in Section 3 would still allow you to apply information you've got in some meaningful way related to odors and emissions.
Okay, great. Commissioner Mills.
I'm similarly okay with the wording as is.
Okay, so maybe what I'll do, Commissioner Nicolello?
I'd also just like to state that I think that the performance standards relate to odors and emissions, vibration and noise, and don't specifically discuss air quality. So that's just something for the commission to note. But I'd also like to say, too, I strongly disagree against any, I would feel really uncomfortable passing this particular section through without the city attorney's office perhaps taking another second look at it. And maybe once you do and you say, no, it's fine, don't worry about it. But I'm thinking that this could definitely be argued from a very discretionary perspective. And I also think, too, that there's still that issue about the fact that it's unclear as to when it's issued, which we did talk, that it had to be issued at building permit. But I think it's one of those things where if we need to talk about it for 5 minutes and it's still unclear and we still have two different ways of looking at it, it probably needs to be a little bit more clear in the language.
So Commissioner Nicolello, and I can get a straw poll vote. I think it's a good suggestion. What I'm hearing is really you're just encouraging legal to look at it and make sure it's defensible and in the right place.
Yes, please.
Okay. So Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, I just want to ask staff, why did you have a pre-clearance letter by LRAPA and not the state? Is it because LRAPA has stronger, stringent criteria?
The applicable air quality agency in our area until they go away, and then it would be DEQ.
Okay, so I've heard a couple of things. So will related items on this, and then I'm going to take a straw poll vote after I get here from, it sounds like Commissioner Mills and anyone else. There's the question also of this pre-clearance letter, that particular process maybe being eliminated by budget, so that's obviously something to consider for staff.
It wouldn't be eliminated. They said DEQ would then do it. Is that not correct?
Okay, so maybe just the language.
There just needs to be a language change for the
Yeah, it could say applicable agency. Not that we've had that discussion with DEQ, or have we?
I don't know, does DEQ do pre-clearances?
I don't know. we worked with El Rapa.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah.
I think you could just say if El Rapa is in existence.
And it also can be, I mean, maybe, it's just note it. It could be a code change if there's jurisdictional changes. So the other item I heard, that Commissioner Mills and Commissioner Baker, they were okay with the language because of the performance measures, but as Commissioner Nicolello has stated, it actually doesn't clearly come back up under the performance measures. So I just wanted, it doesn't talk about the compliance, but the point I wanted to actually add to that is that they have to legally comply anyways. So it's a mission in this.
El Rapa's regulations.
Yeah.
So really the intent here was to put applicants on notice of permits that are beyond the city's control and require that up front to improve communication.
And I believe odors and emissions does cover air quality.
Yeah. I meant the actual text.
Permit.
Yeah. But it seems like what I'm hearing from you, it's really not necessary because it's going to be mandated anyways.
When a permit is required by El Rapa, that's a separate process, separate from the city.
The only thing that would not be covered by other agencies is where we put in specific things like smelling it at the property line.
Correct.
Yep.
Those kinds of things will have to have different things being addressed if they're left in the language.
That's a contract with you. That's it.
Yeah, we hired Randall.
So
Yeah,
I'd like
there
to
you go.
get
He can
a
walk
show
the
of
perimeter.
hands. So really what we're encouraging staff to do is look at have legal, look at the language, make sure it's defensible. 2 is take a look, figure out how we might want to address this pre-clearance letter, Al Rapa's involvement. Maybe we leave it, we adjust the code at the time, or add different language to have some flexibility. Who's the jurisdiction that has that authority? And verify that they do that process. So all those in favor of just kind of handing this to staff to do a little work and get back to us? Yeah, all those in favor of that. I'm seeing question on Commissioner Mills' face, so if you have a question, please ask.
You just laid out a very broad suggested scope of work for
Yeah.
them to do. And I think that there's some things that I think need to be done. I'm not sure the language needs to be readdressed. I guess I'm in a disagreement with Commissioner Nicolello about it. But in some of the other things, like, the La Rapa reference, sure, that's an easy thing. But I guess I'm...
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm the same way.
Okay, but maybe I'll just do this. I'm not sure it hurts to have legal take a look at that. I guess that's why I was doing that. But let's just, how many people would leave the language exactly as it is, with the exception of making sure that we've got this actually, maybe, who wants to leave the language as it is?
Well, I think
I'll leave it as it is.
Okay, all those in favor, just pull a vote? All those that want to leave the
Can I
language
ask
as is?
a clarification? I think, do you mean leave the language as it is, that it says El Rapa, or it says El Rapa or DQ?
I'm just, right now, I'm saying leave the language as it is. All those in favor? Because then we've got one. Okay, so all those in favor of leaving the language as it is, but clarifying, staff's going to do some work, clarify the pre-clearance letter piece and whoever's the regulating jurisdiction. All those in favor? Okay, that's 6 in favor.
No,
And all those opposed?
My concern is I think you need to change the agency, but you don't need to change the wording. So we haven't had that as an option.
That, it's giving them, right now, do you disagree, and then so we're
Well,
right in between them.
Could I add an amendment to the proposal that we change it to just change the wording, vote on just changing the wording to deal with the agencies, and then have a vote to...
That's what
That's what they're
that vote
doing.
was.
So the thing is, we don't know what to change it to at this point, because we've asked staff to go back to verify, first of all, does DEQ have this process?
That was my understanding.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was...
Okay. No,
completely
we're just
opening it
not proposing specific language at this time. We're giving staff direction to get back to us.
But we're not opening up the language.
No.
Just if
Okay, that's fine. I'm in
try
favor
and
of that.
work it in.
Okay, why don't we do that vote again? All those in favor of leaving the language as it is, letting staff do some research to clarify the authority, jurisdictional authority for this, and come back with us with language if that needs to change. All those in favor? It's unanimous. So there is one other piece that Commissioner Nicolello brought up, and that is this except for land use applications. So we left the language in place, but that except for land use applications in relation, do you want to talk about that in terms of maybe clarification in other code sections that?
Yeah, just if staff wants to look at that and perhaps come up with a way to make that a little bit more clear, because the way that it reads right now is a little bit unclear. So maybe just specify, are you looking for a pre-clearance letter of building permit? Can somebody package it as part of their land use application? If you have that information, kind of what phase of the process do you want it in? Because the way that it reads now is you don't have to do it if you're doing a land use application. And I'm presuming that's probably not the case.
Yeah, I don't know. I will check with staff. I don't know what the intent was. And yeah, but it sounds to me like at least you and maybe other commissioners want to make sure that this is also required where a land use application is required, that at some point this pre-clearance letter is submitted.
So let me get a straw poll vote. The pre-clearance letter. So right here, except for land use applications, the way it reads, it's kind of true, is that basically if you're required to do a land use application, you're not actually required to get this pre-clearance letter. What I think we need is some additional clarification, because maybe it's just not at the time of the land use application and it happens at building permit. So let me take a straw poll vote so we can actually speed it along. How many people would like to make sure that if a project has a land use application, that it also has to go through a similar process?
It has to obtain a pre-clearance letter.
It does.
Yeah.
It has to.
We have a discussion?
Sure. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I'm just trying to clarify, do we mean by this land use application a land use subdivision? In other words, not really an application, but a subdivision of land, and so is that?
That's a land use application.
So why don't we just, maybe somebody wants to direct us to just cross out the words except for land use applications.
That's what I was going to say.
Like, that'd be
That's
pretty
brilliant.
easy.
Yeah, that's,
So all those in favor of crossing out except for land use applications?
Again, I just,
You have a, hang on,
Discussion.
sorry.
could
Commissioner
staff
Baker.
clarify what that means? Does that mean that a property division would require a pre-clearance letter?
Yes.
Means everything would.
So, that to me is a concern. Now we're requiring a pre-clearance letter where all you're doing is dividing property.
Can I make a point? I get really hesitant when we do land use code on the fly because we come up with really cruddy code sometimes. Not that we don't all have the best intentions, but we're not attorneys. So I think that we should not be making a decision about what code to cross out here. I think that that's something that staff should come up with. We'll take a look at it and we should discuss it next time around, because Commissioner Baker brings up a really great point. So if we're going to we need to be able to delve into that a little bit more, and that's something that I think, like, maybe we just make a motion for that staff comes back with some recommended code criterion, whatever the proper plural is, and then brings it back to us.
I can make that.
Okay.
You want me to make a motion?
Commissioner Jaworski, we're not actually doing motions.
Yeah, we
So
need to move
Commissioner
on.
Jaworski,
You know,
yeah,
so
we
if
do.
we're- If it's the will of the commission.
Yeah, exactly. Commissioner
do it.
Jaworski?
yeah, if we're crossing things out or whatever, I just thought the whole purpose of this was to protect that area when you're doing development. So if it just said any development within the Clear Lake overlay zone has to have this letter.
It says development permit.
So what I think we probably ought to do, and as we go through this, we may add a few more.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, it wasn't subdivision of land that I was looking at. It's a development that we're looking at that
Right.
we want to protect so that it doesn't create odors.
So let's have some time to I want to work with substantive staff planning who worked on this stuff, and have my own review also of all the things having to do with LRAPA and air quality. This being the first one, this section, and I think we may have a few more as you go through.
Yeah. So I just, let's get a show of hands. We'll have staff report back. There are two main topics here. One, the jurisdictional authority that would actually be involved in this process as articulated, and the other one is we would like to see at the time of development that this be enforced. So a land use application, anything that's moving forward, it seems like that's the concern. So just for staff to explore that. All those in favor? All those opposed? Okay, so that's 6-1. Thank you. The next item was a single business operation, just having staff look at operation, and that was something I brought up.
Develop a definition.
Yeah, to
for that.
develop a definition. So any discussion?
Or change the wording, right?
Yeah. All those in favor?
Again, I'm not sure what we're doing here.
So rather than repeat the whole piece that I had talked about, it's looking at operation and the concern that operation, there are oftentimes one industrial use that has many operations within its single business, within its single use. For instance, they have a lab, they test it, then they manufacture it, and they distribute it, all in one site. All one user, one owner, but they have several operating characteristics. And just clarifying operation.
So I would interpret that direction as to come back with a proposed definition or change of word if that's what we recommend.
Great.
Okay.
I have no confusion about what's meant here, and
Okay.
I've been in hundreds of facilities, so this is clear to me, but I'm going to allow that it might not be clear to somebody else, so.
And my particular concern is, for instance, operations. If you look at other land use application, operations is used differently. So it's how our land use code uses that word. Commissioner Borowski.
Further on in this section.
Can we,
yeah.
let's
Okay.
just do this one?
Yep.
Okay. All those in favor of just having staff look at this item and get back to us? Unanimous. Okay, the next piece is separation. There were a few items in this. There is, why don't we maybe start with Commissioner Mills, no blast furnaces.
To me, we'll just leave this with staff, and they can decide if they really want to say blast furnaces or not. I think it's a silly term to have in here in this location. It's just technically wrong.
So all those in favor of having staff look at this piece of language and get back to us? All those, yep, it's unanimous. And the next item was the 1,000 feet. It's Commissioner Borowski's, and I didn't write all of the details, but he's got his hands up.
Yep.
So please clarify what your piece is.
Yeah, I would like, before I vote affirmative on this section, and this can come back, it would be helpful for me to have the map and show what the overlay of the 1,000 feet is. So if that could be brought back to us at the next meeting, so that we can actually see that and say these industries are going to need to be set back and it will affect this property. And so we can have a visual of that. That's all I'm asking before I vote in affirmative on this section.
Commissioner Nicolello?
It'd also be helpful to kind of get some more clarification on, is this, I think Commissioner Randall brought this up, but whether or not it's a setback, because that's a standard I know, but separation isn't one I think I've seen before, so that would be helpful.
Okay, Commissioner Randall.
And just to jump into that, since I was the one who brought up setbacks, setbacks usually apply to buildings. And so if we're more concerned with that being the actual use rather than the building, setback may not be the appropriate word. So separation might actually be a more appropriate word, just to...
Is separation defined?
No, we should probably.
Okay, because it would be curious to know like how a
may
use
want to
is
define
separated.
separation. I'm
Or
starting
it
to
could just
think
be a building and a parking lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
setback.
starting to think separation might be the appropriate term, but it may need
You would have to have a
definition.
setback on
Yeah.
top of the 1,000
Yeah.
feet.
Yeah.
Does it start from,
Separation's the
like-
right term.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
does it
why a
start
map
from,
would be
like-
useful, and we will produce that.
Well, the question is, does it start from like the beginning of the use? I mean, how do you measure a separation? And I'm once again thinking too, like, if I was, talking to a hearings official about this, how would I try and define it?
Commissioner Mills, did you have a comment?
Just to comment in that, I'm not going to support the exemption for targeted industries here. It's either separated or it's not. It's either a health concern and a safety concern or it's not. And you're not going to relieve health and safety for the sake of a targeted industry. And that would be, if it's health and safety, it's health and safety. If it's not, it's not. But I don't think you make an exception to health and safety because it's a targeted industry.
And I know there were some questions regarding the wholesale warehousing and distribution from Commissioner Baker. So I'm wondering if this particular separation section, maybe we get some further clarification and wait to hold off on.
I also have
straw
a comment
poll
about
vote.
warehousing. There was a suggestion that once the operation is placed, we're going to restrict the use of that warehouse to only operations associated with that. First, that's not going to be enforceable. Secondly, I don't think it's a reasonable thing to do. Once you have a warehouse, you have to figure out how to keep operate and survive with that warehouse, and that might involve contracting part of that space for other people.
Commissioner Baker.
And in fact, that was my concern, because the way it's worded, it's so vague, you can't tell. So, for example, let's say a large freezer plant, right, that stores food for many other companies that happen to work out in that area and manufacture things. Mm-hmm. If that's allowable, make sure the wording says that, if that's what it's meant. If it doesn't mean that can occur, then say the wording doesn't allow that. That's my concern is just I can't tell what that wording means.
Could I make a suggestion?
Yes.
It might be that you're trying to direct us to come back with a clear standard for exactly what uses can happen. And we tried to do that, but it's clearly not there yet. But we would love to develop a clear and objective standard that really gets at, enumerates the lists, because maybe it's not targeted industries, maybe it's particular ones. And I'm thinking food and beverage, which we provided as an example. This was around our research into food hubs and the agglomeration and sharing of resources in the food and beverage industry. So if you're comfortable with that, letting us kind of come back with something that enumerates the things that we don't want to preclude, especially on the south side of Clear Lake. There is interest in having that sort of facility here, and so we want to encourage that by having flexible enough language to let those things happen without it being discretionary. That's the challenge.
Thank you, Terry. So what I'm going to suggest is that we take Section D, separation, and we hold off, have staff get back to us. All those in favor? Okay, it's unanimous. The next section I have is the performance standards, and really the concern came from Commissioner Mills as well as a couple of other commissioners echoed the same sentiment, was that the odors and emissions of vibration is just not clear enough. It's too vague. So Commissioner Nicolello.
Oh, well, you were going to say something. I think it was your point. So do you
I was just going to, we had a lot of discussion about pre-clearance, for example, and I'd be real interested to see if any pre-clearance would ever be granted on these two things by an agency, and I'm willing to bet that it would be very problematical to get a pre-clearance on those two items.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So I think the pre-clearance is a RAPA thing, but I think that I'm actually, in terms of odors, emissions, vibration, and noise, I think that so if these were going to appeal, somebody would not be able to just say, I feel the that sounded really hippie. I feel the vibrations. And, like you can't just state it and then it stands as that. An expert testimony would have to be retained in order to move forward with that, and for it to be considered to be an impact that's supported by reasonable evidence. So I'm actually okay with keeping these in because it puts the onus on the developer to be able to prove that. And if it does go to an appeal, you would have to retain the appropriate expert who would help you be able to prove that you do, in fact, not have those impacts. So I'm comfortable with those as they stand.
Commissioner Borowski and then Commissioner Jaworski.
So my reading of this is a little bit different, and I'm reading of it. So you have to place a statement that you will comply, but yet there is a compliance issue going forward. So if you write your statement, says, yep, I'm going to comply, you build your factory, and somebody says, I smell grape harvesting, I smell grape, people making wine at your property line. So then it goes to compliance with the city of Eugene. Doesn't have to do with land use, doesn't have to do with clear and objective standards, doesn't have to do with anything with that. It's a business that has to do with the compliance section of the code. And as a business owner who's dealt with the compliance section of the code, it's onerous. So if I look at a piece of property and say, I want to build a applesauce manufacturing plant here, and this is in the code, I'm not building my applesauce manufacturing there, because after I put $20 million into a plant, a resident or somebody can stand at the property line and say, I smell applesauce, fix it. And I'm not going to take that risk. And that is it's going to make these properties undevelopable.
Commissioner Jaworski, and then you're next.
Yeah, I brought up this issue only because I understand that it was a really big issue when you were developing it out in that area by the people that live out there. I just don't know how it could be written to be somewhat enforceable, or how we would ensure compliance. And as legal has said, that even in the initial stage, they don't even have to have a letter from El Rapa or whatever. They can force the application and move forward. And depending on their size, I don't even know if they have to go to DEQ for certain permitting, depending on what they're doing, because I don't know what the standards are here in Oregon. So we really have, like you said, they're building a plant. They've had no problem. They haven't had to have any compliance things. Someone complains about something, or their emissions, you're cleaning your car every day and you're wondering why. I don't see how that's enforceable, and that's where my problem is how do you enforce this? I think that's really got to be looked at strongly to say what would one do here? Because I think if the neighbors complain that much initially in the development of the code, they're going to follow through with it if in fact it's not working that way when development occurs.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So I just want to really, I respect the fact that there are issues with enforcement, and that happens all over the city. But what we have in front of us is land use approval criteria with performance standards to ensure that the person does comply with these issues. And then at that point, the process continues and it becomes in the realm of enforcement. I think that we have to be really, really careful when we look at land use criteria and we try and load all of these other things into it. Performance standards are something that a developer has to state that they will abide by. If they do not abide by that, that's when we get kicked into the enforcement process. And then the enforcement process is not doing well, then that's something that needs to be taken up with enforcement, not with the land use code.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've generally agreed that we don't have an issue with C. It's just easy to measure. I think B and A, there's some general concern that we're using some vague wording. I would just suggest that we check with El Rapa and DEQ and find if there's any better wording. If not, then we leave it the way it is. I think you want to have a requirement that odors and emissions and vibration are performance standards that an applicant says they have to meet, because we have we have concerns from the neighborhood nearby that basically have, if you look at the drawings, they get the majority of all the air pollution in Eugene already, and we are trying not to increase that. So I do think we need to have these requirements there. Maybe the wording needs to be tweaked a little bit based upon current wording, but I don't have a problem with leaving those clauses in there.
Commissioner Borowski and then Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are our stabs at environmental justice. And it's a new area of realm, and trying to figure out how to write environmental justice into a code, obviously, is tricky. And I don't think that I don't have any problems with with trying to limit things that have health and safety issues to the neighboring communities, which I hope are being addressed through the regular LRAPA stuff. You know, particulates per million, these types of things that are already regulated. My concern is the word odors, okay? And an odor may be obnoxious, and I would like to try and figure out what an obnoxious odor is. But what's obnoxious to you and what's obnoxious to me are different. And to try and figure that out in a code and just say, if you can smell it, it's obnoxious, and you can't have that at your property line, is tough for me to jump that hurdle. Because, like I said earlier, I liked when Williams bread was in my neighborhood and I could smell it, okay? I wouldn't like it if a pulp mill were in my neighborhood and I smelled that. But the amount of damage that's doing to me may be exactly the same. And to say that I have to, if you smell it, you can't have it there. And I think it will drive away anybody who wants to come to that thing that may have odors.
So what I want to do is find out, so right now we have 4 minutes left, and we have this section, which obviously we've been having discussions on the odors, emission, and vibration. Those two sections. Prohibited uses, there was a comment about colored glass fabrication and taking off the reconstituted wood products manufacturer and kind of comparing it with the comp plan. And the other item was from Commissioner Borofsky in terms of site review criteria, and then Commissioner Nicolello. Adjustment review, sorry about that, thank you for the clarification. And then section 9.4170, section 3, right?
Yes.
So clarification of section 3. So we only have 3 minutes. So I am actually going to ask staff, how do you want us to address this? What would be the most efficient way, considering we have one more deliberation? You've heard the concerns.
Yeah, I mean, we could take a stab at the concerns that we heard today and write you a memo with our recommended response to those. We could certainly do that. I think you're going to need a little bit more time to work your way through the rest of these. And we have the time that we have. So I don't want to rush you. I want to provide the information that will be helpful in a recommendation. So I think we have actually plenty to work with to come back with something. Do you agree, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I could use maybe 30, 35 seconds. I think that I'd like to understand a little bit more about what we need to clarify in 3 on the division. And then with that in mind, I think staff have enough to work through, and we could come back with something that addresses your concerns or gives you enough to say, this one still needs a little work, council, we'd like you to do that. And we could do it in a memo with some attachments, try to get it to you in plenty of time to look at before your next deliberations.
Right.
Does that work?
Yeah, Commissioner Borofsky?
So a couple of things. Thank you for that, and I think that might work. A couple of things process-wise. I don't know about the rest of the commission, but I could clear more time on my calendar for a longer meeting next Monday if other people can, just in consideration of where we are in the book. That's a process question. The other thing that I'm very concerned about, what Emily just said, was us taking things here that we haven't had time to figure out and go through and punting it to council. Because we're much more aware of the issues, and we're here to advise council and just say, council, look at this a little bit more. I don't feel that we're doing our job to the full extent. So I would rather try and find more time if we need it to flush it out correctly, rather than sending a memo saying, council, look at this, because the planning commission didn't have time.
Commissioner Nicolello?
I think that Commissioner Bobrowski's point about maybe doing a longer meeting on Monday, I think that's a great idea. And I'll also say too, for clarification about 3, just to save time, would it help if I sent you maybe kind of some notes or like recommended kind of wording? I don't want to sound presumptuous.
No,
but I'm
no,
saying
that
I
would be
send you
wonderful.
recommended
That's just
wording.
one, I didn't have clear notes to myself. I don't know if anyone else did. And
Yeah.
we want to make sure we nail these as best we can, so.
Totally. I think really what I thought might be helpful is just to say land division as defined in the Eugene Code. So once again,
Okay,
just
so
tying that.
you think I did understand what you were bringing
I think
up?
so.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll send you what I thought, but
Thank you.
Commissioner Mills?
I'm for more time, too. I don't think we should hurry past this and send something to council that is not fully considered. Under 3A and B, I think that some of these things are objective and can be made objective. Smoke, dust, fumes, gases, can all have objective standards. And you can talk to and get advised by LARAPA about that. They can provide measurement standards for that. Odors, there are standards, but they don't work because of what Commissioner Randall said earlier, and that's the biggest concern that I have is odors. Vibration, once again, I think that there are objective standards that you can enforce at the property line, and you can get those. So I think that there's work to be done here to make most of this objective and clear and above dispute. I think we're going to end up landing on odors before we're done, and whether or not it can be done. I'm not sure there's an easy way out of that.
So we're out of time. I do have 2 commissioners, if you can keep it kind of short, and then I want to see what people's availability is. Commissioner Randall and then Commissioner Jaworski.
And I was going to mention I can go longer next week as well.
Okay, I'll take a
And,
vote.
yeah, and then on the land division on 3, I think really just a clear definition of land division, subdivision, partition line,
Thank you,
lot
yeah.
line adjustment, those kinds of things I think would really help in that.
Commissioner Jaworski?
Yeah, I'm just going to follow up on Mills. On my main question on emissions was standards. Where I worked, when when our equivalent to DEQ got involved, they had the same standard per industry, whether it was in the woods or next to residences. So that's what I was asking. What are those standards, and are they applicable to compatibility with the neighborhood?
Yeah, and I have a
And
comment
that's
on
what
that.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready to
Yeah.
have me say it.
Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to mention all of this definitely has been brought up through the course of developing this code language. And the issue about odors came out of, at the time we were developing this, there was a case of sriracha plant in LA causing burning eyes and things because chili peppers, when they're roasted, have not only an odor but an emission of damaging. So that was the context in which this was developed. And the other comment I would have about odors is that they're not tackled by LRAPA, is my understanding, and this was an attempt to strengthen or improve the process that they have already in place with the City of Eugene's enforcement process, which Commissioner Nicolello was alluding to. So it has been worked through with our staff, Rochelle Nicholas and her enforcement staff, to the degree that they feel comfortable enforcing this, just like they do any other complaint or nuisance problem that they see across the city. So just a little bit of context for where that came from.
So can I get thank you. Can I get a show of hands, how many people, and why don't we say a half an hour?
No.
More. Well, so
do you want to give my page up?
I think that now it's getting too complicated. So what I'm going to do is, how about an email doodle follow-up? Does that work, Robin? And if we can't get a quorum, we will maybe use that second deliberation time. But I'll leave it to staff to figure out.
Could we start the meeting earlier?
So why don't we go via email, just so we don't make this a whole dialogue of how much time earlier? And
Try for
30
a
minutes.
3-hour meeting, though.
Let's see what availability is. Yeah.
A doodle poll would be helpful.
Yeah.
People could mark what it looks like for them. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Commissioner
Real
Mills.
quick comment. We spent a lot of time here spearing language and all the hard work of staff. And I want to just make sure that staff is clear on where I'm coming from on this, and that this is an incredibly hard piece of work you've been doing here. I really appreciate the work. And if I've sounded overly critical, I apologize for that. You guys have done a lot of great work here. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for staying 5 minutes late. Sorry about that. And watch your email for that doodle poll for next week. Thank you so much.